Please feel free to ask any questions as we go along, or you might want to save all your questions to the end. Both are absolutely fine. So the way that I've structured things is just to tell you a little bit about who I am, and then tell you a little bit about this job of being a genetic counsellor, what that means, and what kind of a day in the life of a genetic counsellor might look like. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you become a genetic counsellor, for those of you who are interested, or maybe know other people who you think might be interested. And then hopefully at the end of that, we'll have lots of time for you to be able to ask me any questions that you might not have thought of during the session, or any that you might just think of when we finish. So why don't I get started by telling you a little bit about who I am. So it's really important for you to pay attention to this description of who I am, because there's going to be a little bit of a poll afterwards to ask you some questions to see if what I've told you can give you some clues. So some of the things I'm going to tell you very explicitly, and some of them are like a bit of a riddle. And I'm not very good at riddles, and I've got two screens, so I'm not ignoring you, but my little riddle that I've written for myself is kind of over here, so I'm going to have to keep referring to it to make sure that I get in all the facts that you need to be able to answer the questions that we're then going to give to you on the next slide. So first of all, things about me. So I grew up in a family where I'm the eldest daughter, and the span, if you can get your head around it, is I was born in the 1970s and the youngest of my siblings was born in the 1990s. So it's a huge gap. So I have been fortunate through my job to live in different countries around the world, work in different countries around the world. I was born in a really large city, really large multicultural city. And if you think about the size of this city compared to all other cities in the world, it would probably be about the size of the 35th if you just account for the numbers of people in that population. I was really lucky. I went to a really multicultural school where I got to learn lots about lots of people's cultures, eat lots of fantastic food, hang out at lots of people's houses where I got to eat delicious things that weren't cooked in my house, and we shared lots about who we were growing up. I was always really passionate about science from primary school, really. And I had this little dictionary called the Usborne Science Dictionary, and I used to walk around with it all the time. And I was really, probably quite boring to lots of people, but I thought I was being fantastically interesting, that anything anybody wanted to raise or talk about, I would flick through my little science dictionary and answer questions for them, because obviously everybody wanted to know about osmosis while they were trying to eat their Sunday dinner. So that was kind of me in primary school. And in secondary school, I still probably loved those things as well. So my school was in a really multicultural part of the same city that I was born in. And when I say multicultural, I guess for scope, we can say that in this city, there are over 200 languages spoken there. When I went through school, I carried on this love of science, but as you can tell, I like chatting. So I also really liked English, I liked reading, I liked drama, I liked music, all sorts of things. So for my A-levels, I did chemistry, biology, English literature, and statistics. Now, I started with maths because I thought that I was smart enough to do 4 straight A-levels, and I really struggled with pure maths. So actually, my statistics was an AS level because I honestly felt like the silliest person in the room because I just couldn't get my head around pure maths, so I only did statistics. Following on from that, I went to university and I have 3 degrees. And as you know, I'm currently doing my PhD, so that will be my 4th. So as a genetic counsellor, I worked in hospitals. So genetic counselling services are normally offered in hospitals. So I worked in NHS hospitals and hospitals overseas. And I did that job for about 10 years. So I told you, because of my job, I get to travel all over the place. So sometimes I get to travel to just talk about the job that I do at different conferences where people want to know about the latest things in the way we work, or we go to learn about genetics things so that we've always got the most up-to-date knowledge to share with our patients. So through this work, I've worked in 3 different cities in the world and across 2 different countries. And the last country that I worked in, only 3% of the population there would describe their ethnicity as Asian. And that's your last clue. Before we will go on to the first poll to see how much of this you were listening to and whether that has helped you answer any of your questions. Okay. So poll number 1, I've written it, but I think Em's going to do fancy things.
So I'm going to press a thing and all of these questions are going to jump onto your screen. Now, I'm very excited about this. I have been trying to listen along, so I'm going to let me and Cindy vote because I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer all of these as well. So on your screen, there should now be quite a big pop-up with all of these questions. It turns out I can't vote because I'm the host, but Cindy can vote. And some of them are multiple choice, so you can click multiple, and some of them you can just click one. So if that's on your screen, click which answer you think is right, and we'll see who thinks what in a second. If anyone's joining us on mobile, I know that polls on mobile don't always like each other, so if you can't use the poll, pop your answers in the chat box and I'll read those out as well.
Absolutely. Would it be useful for me to read through the questions, or do you think everyone's happy to just
go for it? Read through those questions.
Okay, all right, no problem. So the first question was, what part of the world was I born in? London, Manchester, or New York? And you can only choose one because I am clever, but not clever enough to be born in 2 places at the same time. What country did I last live in? So I told you that I'd worked in 2 cities. So what country is one of those cities in? So South Africa, Jamaica, or Finland? I told you about that big gap between me being the oldest and my youngest sibling, but how many of us are there in total? 1, 3, or 5? I think I've written 1, 5, or 3. 1, 5, or 3. Again, only a single choice. What was my favorite subject at school? So I think this is probably the easiest one to answer. Biology, English, or music? And what subject did I not study at university? Biology, genetics, or literature?
We've got quite a lot of votes in so far, but it's a lot of questions. I'm going to leave it on the screen for a minute or so. Probably a good thing I can't vote. I'm not sure I'd get them all right. although I'm sure you sent me the answers, so I should be able to get them right.
Yeah, I might have cheated there a bit. I need to remember the last 2, I think. I forgot. Oh dear.
There's a little graph come up with the...
well, in a second, once we've got all the votes on,
right,
I will launch that, and I'll also say what's the most popular. So I'll give it another...
Okay.
Got about 60% of people have voted, so we'll give it another 30 seconds. You're really quizzing us.
I would say the next one's easier, but I'm not sure. I don't think I give any clues for that one.
We'll all be picking you as our next mastermind topic. Awesome. That looks like most people have had a go at voting, so I'm going to stop the poll there and I can share results. I think that's on everyone's screen. But for question 1, most people went for London. Sasha, is that correct?
That is correct. I was born and raised in London. I put Manchester there though, however, because remember I said I worked in more than one city. Manchester is the city that I've worked for the longest as a genetic counsellor, even though London was the city I was born in. So I worked for about 9 years in Manchester as a genetic counsellor and a year in London as a genetic counsellor. So, okay.
For the second one then, most people said that the last country you lived in was South Africa.
Absolutely. The last country that I lived in was South Africa, also a really fabulous, multicultural, diverse country. They have 11 national languages in South Africa, and I lived there and worked there as a genetic counsellor in about 3 or 4 different hospitals in Johannesburg.
Awesome. I think Cindy's from South Africa, unless I've completely... Yeah, half my family is actually in Joburg, and I was born in Cape Town, near Cape Town.
Very multicultural.
Very beautiful part of the world, Cape Town.
Oh, stunning. I was about an hour away at the beach.
Making me all jealous now. Right, siblings. It's a close one. Not many people went for 1, which is good, but it's pretty split between 5 and 3. 5 has just won.
Just picked it. And 5 is wrong. So actually, 3.
I think everyone remembered that there was such a big age gap that there just must have been lots of kids.
No, we're all crammed at one end, and then there's a baby.
Okay, and then your favourite subject at school, most people have gone for biology, with English being the next most popular.
Yeah, that biology and English are probably the two favourites. But as I said, I kind of did like music and drama and stuff as well. I was a bit of an all-rounder, but science was definitely the thing I liked to talk about the most, which is really important to say. That people love science in different ways. I like talking about it.
Yeah. And then what subject have you not studied at university? Most people are gone for literature.
And most people are absolutely right. By the time you get to university, you have to choose your love, unfortunately. And so it wasn't that I stopped loving English or stopped loving books or talking, but I did biology, and then to become a genetic counsellor, you study genetics as well, genetic counselling specifically. But I will talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Okay. All right, so now telling you a little bit about this job. So genetic counselling is one of those jobs that if you meet people and, oh, my screen's not moving. Let's try this instead. Okay. Genetic counselling is one of those jobs that if you meet people, no one really knows what you do unless they've met one. And then even when you go to explain what you do, it's really quite hard to say it in one word. So if you Google it, you might come up with an explanation like this. So I'll go through this explanation and try to make it make more sense than the possible big words that maybe aren't necessary to describe what we do. So genetic counselling is a process of communication to help families. So that's really important, that genetic counselling is a process. So you have people who just do it as a job. So like me, who's a genetic counsellor, and that's my primary job, and I think about that for all sorts of genetic conditions. But you have other people who work in genetics or work with specific groups of patients for specific conditions who might also use genetic counselling as a process as part of their work. So you might have someone who's a genetic doctor, for instance, so someone that we would call a geneticist, medical geneticist who sees patients, and they might still use genetic counselling as part of what they do to diagnose patients. And what I do as a genetic counsellor is a little bit different than that, but I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So this process of genetic counselling helps people to understand about a genetic condition and its inheritance. So that's about how the genetic condition has happened or arisen, and also how it's passed on in a family, or maybe not passed on, like how it has started for the first time. So that's one of the really important things when people get a genetic condition, is often they're things they're never heard of, often they're things that maybe affect not just them, but other people in the family. So part of it is kind of working out that risk for them and working out who this might impact in other people. So adjusting to the occurrence. So an occurrence is the fact that something has even happened. So genetic conditions are often really rare. If we count up genetic conditions together, they're actually quite common, but individually, genetic conditions are quite rare. So often you'll find that people who have a genetic condition may not know many other people with it, or they may see their GP or a doctor who says, you know, that I've only ever seen one other patient with it. So it's quite a big deal to get your head around if it's a condition you've never heard of before. And this risk of recurrence. So actually, if it's something that has, you know, maybe affected you in a pregnancy, it's about the risk of that happening in future pregnancies as well. So that's what recurrence means, the fact that it might happen again. So with all genetic conditions, they are all different, and there's all different sorts of treatment. There's also different sorts of management, all different sorts of decisions, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, that might be available to you, needed to be made by you once a genetic condition is diagnosed. So this process of genetic counselling is also about discussing the course of action that someone might want to take now that a diagnosis has been made. And we take all sorts of things into consideration when we help people to have that conversation. And we call it like a decision-making conversation. And it's a decision that we are trying to help people to make for themselves so that they can adjust to what the consequences of that decision are. So in order to do that, we need to think lots about people's belief systems, their value systems, but also to know quite a lot about the conditions and the genetics and the science and the tests and the results of the conditions as well. So you'll see that genetic counselling is kind of like this mixture of lots of different strands. which, when you look at my life, me saying I was wandering around with my dictionary and I really liked a bit of music and a bit of drama and a bit of science, why it's a job that I really enjoy so much, and why I maybe feel as though, even though I didn't know about it when I was picking my A-levels or picking my first degree, that coming to it now, it kind of fits with all these bits that I find really important for me to do in my day-to-day life. So the passion about science and about telling people about science, but also about doing that in a way that means that people can make decisions based on that information. So a genetic counsellor, therefore, is somebody that often deals with a family. So we may see someone to talk about the risk of a condition in their family. That person might have a test for a specific condition in their pregnancy. So it might be something that's come up on a scan, for instance, that looks as though it might have a genetic cause, and they might see a genetic counsellor to talk about the chance of that and to talk about any tests that might be available to clarify that. And then about all the decisions that might need to be made or could be made based on that result. We might also see people when things have happened in the family more than they are commonly seen in the general population. So something like cancer, about 1 in 2 to 1 in 3 of us, if we live long enough, will develop a cancer at some point in our lives. But actually individual cancers aren't that common. So if we take, for instance, say the risk of breast cancer, for instance, the risk of that is about 10%. So that's about, out of 100 women, about 10 women will develop breast cancer. And so actually people might get worried if they look at their family history and they see that in their family there are more people than they would expect just by general population numbers to have a particular condition or have breast cancer, for instance. And sometimes that's something people come to talk to us about in genetics, about the chance that something might be genetic just because it's happened lots in their family. People might also be referred to see genetics if a genetic doctor, for instance, has diagnosed a particular condition in their child. So often children might have difficulty with learning or development, and all sorts of other medical tests are done to see if we can find out a diagnosis or a name for that genetic condition. And often once a named condition is found within a family, a genetic counsellor is somebody who kind of takes over management of that family and looks after that family. So it means that we can talk about the risks and the management for the child that they have, about the options for future children and future ways of having their family if they want to have another child and they are really don't want to have a child who's affected by the same condition. If a condition is found in the family, often that means that there might be a risk for other people in the family, particularly other people who are at the age of having children themselves. So helping families who are able to have that conversation with other families and share that information is another really big part of genetic counselling, kind of facilitating the sharing of genetic information within families. And sometimes people come as individuals for themselves. So it might be that they know they had a parent with a particular condition or a more distant relative with a particular condition. Sometimes it might be that they didn't grow up with their birth family and they find out very late that there's a particular genetic condition in the family. So again, it might be talking to a genetic counsellor about what tests are available, what tests aren't available if we haven't got all the information, but also really crucially how people feel about that and how that's impacting them. So when people say genetics, they often just think of tests, that it's just a blood test, or sometimes people think of saliva tests. So if you think about genetic testing that you might see in crime movies or soap operas or those types of things, people have an idea about, well, what happens in genetics must be all about blood tests that just look at DNA. And that's largely what we do. But like I said before, sometimes those tests aren't available. So sometimes we actually don't have the genetic information from the DNA, even though when we look at a family, we can see that there must be a genetic or a hereditary component to a condition. And we can still talk about how that feels. We can still put management in place to manage those risks. They're higher for those patients. So things that we might suggest are screening tests. So things like mammograms, more frequently than the general population if people have a higher risk of breast cancer. We might suggest more frequent heart scans for people who might have a family where they have a genetic predisposition to certain heart conditions, or we might talk about particular tests during pregnancy. And so those tests can be used to find out whether a child before they are born has a genetic diagnosis. They may also tell people that they have not. So those tests can be done, you know, for information, or they may be done because there are options or decisions that can be made for that pregnancy and for that family if they know about that genetic condition before a baby is born. So again, the thing that I want you to bear in mind through all of that is kind of the amount of genetic information that you need to know, but also how individual each person is and how different they may process that information, the different questions they may have from that information, and all the different options. So one of the things that's really important for genetic counsellors is we never tell people what to do. So we really try to help people to make the decision under no pressure from us or pressure from their family to make the right decision for themselves. And in order to make the right decisions, we feel that it's really important for them to have all of this information. So lots of what genetic counsellors do, as well as managing people's psychological well-being, is kind of delivering large amounts of information about lots of different types of genetic conditions, a couple of which we've spoken about already. So told you a little bit about the job. So now I think there's another poll, if I'm right. So there's less questions this time, and I have given no clues really.
So this one feels like a massive test.
So I don't expect you to necessarily get any of these right unless you know lots about genetics already. And it's really just a way of me to tell you a little bit more about genetics.
If it's any consolation, I definitely can't get most of these right either. So okay. Yeah, have a guess, and then Sasha can tell us lots more about all the facts.
Yeah. I saw all these answers this morning, and now I'm thinking I can't even remember. Oh no.
Okay, so the first question was, how many genetic conditions are there? 300, 10,000, or 6,000? These are approximate numbers, so I don't think anybody knows absolutely. What is the most common genetic condition in the UK? So there's a condition called hemochromatosis, a condition called sickle cell disease, and a condition called Down syndrome. You may have heard of some, either or none of them, but which do you think is the most common? How many countries in the world have genetic counsellors? So it is quite an unusual job. So that might help your answer. So around 30, less than 10, or more than 100. And for comparison, there are 195 countries in the world, something like that.
Something like that. There's a few sort of disputed, but in the region of.
Imagine being a disputed country.
Yeah.
And what percentage of genetic counsellors in the world are Black? This one blew my mind a little bit, so that's why it's in there.
Awesome. I think most people have had a go at voting, so I'll share those results. So the first one then, there's no one who's gone for 300, which
split.
Yeah, so it's split between the two big numbers, which is where my vote would have gone for one of the big numbers.
One of the big numbers. Yeah. So when I started, we used to say 8,000. And then when I looked to do the poll to see what people say now, they say around 6,000.
Oh, interesting. So just like it's actually gone down.
Yeah, which is odd. So I guess just like disputed countries, there might be disputed conditions. I'm not sure why that is, because as genetic kind of testing advances and we get more sophisticated ways of looking at DNA and looking at genomes, that to me would mean that we would discover more genetic conditions. But I guess maybe we've discovered that because genetic conditions sometimes are really broad and quite varied. And so maybe things that were thought of as quite distinct things, when you actually look at what causes them, they may be caused by the same gene and actually on a spectrum of things. So that might be one of the other reasons that I guess numbers come down.
It's unusual though, isn't it? Because usually the classic one in science is we have a prediction, we do some studying, and the better our technology gets, the more we find. So the fact that it's gone down is, but I guess it's to do with like being able to sort of group conditions better,
grouping things and understanding things, and also so scientists and doctors often did this very nice thing of just naming things after themselves. And true. So I guess when things were done, when we didn't have so much connection between countries and sharing genetic information and all of those types of things, I guess it's not so wild to think that some doctor over here in a disputed country might name something after himself there, and someone else might name something after themselves there, and then we realize that they were actually all talking about the same very rare thing that just happened to happen in two different parts of the world, maybe. So what is the most common condition in the UK?
This was very split. So sickle cell has won, but not by a huge margin. It's sickle cell, Down syndrome, and then hemochromatosis. I can't say the last one, but
hemochromatosis.
that one. So yeah, it's fairly split.
I would have gone for sickle cell, but when I looked it up, it kept saying hemochromatosis. So hemochromatosis, I get why it possibly is more common. So I'll go through each of the conditions. So hemochromatosis is a condition of iron overload in the blood. And you need to have two parents who are carriers, so two parents who might be healthy but have a gene for hemochromatosis, and they both pass it on to a child, and then that child develops hemochromatosis. Generally, hemochromatosis doesn't cause very severe life-threatening problems. So I wonder if when we talk about severe genetic conditions, maybe hemochromatosis doesn't get a look in as the most common genetic disease. It's managed through, so people who get lots of iron that accumulates in the blood might often have like blood transfusions regularly to remove iron in the blood. And women, while they are who have hemochromatosis, this is like an interesting fact, that because they have periods every month, so you essentially are having blood transfusions every month, they often don't get the same problems with iron overload until much later when they reach menopause, because actually their periods manage their iron levels. But they still kind of need good monitoring of their iron levels. So once iron levels are monitored well, it's actually a very livable condition. So maybe that's why. Sickle cell disease is very common, sickle cell anemia. Again, a condition of the blood. So it's a condition that describes the shape of the red blood cell, and rather than being shaped like a kind of perfect circle, it's shaped like a sickle. And that means that the blood can get clogged and stuck in kind of arteries and joints and cause pain. It also means that it can be kind of less effective at carrying oxygen to parts of the body that need it. And so people who have sickle cell disease often have what's described as crises, where there are these moments where they kind of have severe pain and things. Often their lives are, painful, and it does limit the span of life to be going through these crises all the time. But kind of treatments and management of sickle cell disease is improving all the time. And so actually people are living much longer with it. It is one of those severe genetic conditions that people might see a genetic counsellor for. So, but it's different in all parts of the world. So when I worked in South Africa, all people who had sickle cell disease in the family would come to my sickle cell clinic and see me. And then in the UK, there are often very specialized sickle cell services where you have a type of genetic counsellor, but one that just sees patients with sickle cell. So they are sickle cell counsellors. So they do the same type of thing, but they only deal with what we call hemoglobinopathies. So they are the different types of sickle cell disease and thalassemia and related conditions. But they do very much the similar type of work as me, but they work specifically with families who are affected by that condition. And Down syndrome is a condition that I guess I wouldn't be surprised that lots of people would vote for that, because it's visibly one that people would see and recognize quite often. It is one of the most common what we call aneuploidies or chromosome conditions. So remember I spoke about people having things that were found on scan or during pregnancy. Sometimes these are the types of things that are found during pregnancy, where all of your genetic information that's contained on all of your chromosomes, your 23 chromosomes, sometimes there are 3 copies of a chromosome when normally there should be 2. And Down syndrome is one of those conditions where there are 3 copies of chromosome number 21. And so that can't happen with most chromosomes. Most chromosomes, a baby wouldn't survive if there were 3 whole copies of a chromosome. But for Down syndrome, that's compatible with life. And so often we see children born and adults with Down syndrome. So it is one of the most common chromosome conditions. And then how many countries in the world have genetic counsellors? So there was a recent paper that kind of tried to find all the genetic counsellors around the world, and they got to about 29 countries. So again, it's not the most, it's not a profession that you would be able to access in lots of different parts of the world. Most of those places that have lots of genetics and lots of genetic counselling services are, countries like England, countries like the USA, obviously South Africa, because, I went to work there. There are Malaysia, Cuba. So there are lots of different parts of the world and more parts of the world all the time, because genetic testing is becoming more available to different parts of the world quicker and cheaper. And so that means that genetic services are able to kind of expand as well. And that means that you need lots of genetic counsellors to help people make decisions based on that information.
I think in places that don't really have this, is that, when you were saying that, like, you've worked in places where they had like a whole specialist, like sickle cell counsellor, whereas in other places you might work more broadly across all diseases. Do you think in like countries that don't have specialist genetic counsellors, it's a informal role that sort of other doctors and medics take on? Because I imagine you can't just not do it. You can't just be like, here's your results, I'm not going to talk to you. But it's just more informal rather than a structured position. Yeah,
so there's two things really. I think the informal definitely does happen, because even, I guess, if you're a nurse that works in that area or a doctor that works in that area, remember I said that genetic counselling is a process. So there might be processes of genetic counselling that you employ in your work when your patients have genetic conditions. Often people might not do that in the detailed way that we do it because we've been trained to do that. So there is that. But also there are countries that have genetic services but don't have genetic counsellors and feel that that process should only be done by genetic doctors. So there's that as well. Okay. So I know that there are some quite big countries, I think maybe France or Holland, a big country where they actually don't have the role genetic counsellor. The genetic counselling is done by medics only. And what's really interesting about that is when you look at the decisions that people make based on the genetic information that they get, you can see that, some of the decisions about, whether to have mastectomies, for instance, so removal of the breast when you're at risk of a breast cancer, are sometimes different in different parts of the country based on what different types of health professionals they might speak to about their risks. So the last one was, what percentage of genetic counsellors in the world are Black? So I saw this statistic probably only about 2 years ago, and the answer is 2%. So it's something that I was probably not very aware of when I started the job, but when you start to work kind of, I guess, around the world, then sometimes you get a little bit, oh, okay, maybe this is something. And then a few other people had kind of said that, like on Twitter, and, there were a few other organizations and stuff that are trying to make sure that even though we do this job in kind of really diverse parts of the world where people are from everywhere, that the workforce should kind of be a bit like that as well. And that's a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in and kind of related to my PhD and things as well. So thank you, that's it. How long have I got? I talked too much, didn't I?
Oh, no, you didn't. No, it's fine. I think most people did pretty well on that poll then. 2% was definitely most common for the last question, and then the how many was more split, but
that's a good number. And as I say, the hemochromatosis sickle cell one, I would go with both of those being the right answer, to be honest, though. They're all kind of the most common of something. Okay, so
Sasha, can I ask just a quick question with the last one?
Yeah.
So you found out 2 years ago that it's 2%. It's still only 2%?
Yeah, I know all of them. What? That's how small it is.
2 years late, still nothing.
Still very low. So when I went to work in South Africa, which is a predominantly Black country, you'll know, I was the only qualified genetic counsellor Black genetic counsellor in South Africa.
In South Africa?
In South Africa. And so really, so the counsellor who qualified as a genetic counsellor, I know her I can text her now, I know her. So she qualified in 2017, and she was in Cape Town, and I was in Johannesburg, and she heard of me, but we never got a chance to meet each other. And then I saw this newspaper article in South Africa where they were really excited that they had the first Black genetic counsellor in South Africa, and I sent her a message, quite cheekily said, well, technically it was me, but as I'm not South African, you can have it.
Wow, that is impressive.
I couldn't speak an African language, so it was a bit rude to claim it, and I was only there for a little bit. So, so we're friends now. And then in the US, which is another really, has diverse kind of populations, I think they have about 9% representation just in the US, but they have loads more counsellors. So in the UK, we have about 300. And in the US, I think they have about 5,000 or so. So their representation, depending how you ask it, can be as high as 9 or a lot less than that. But so then once you add up everybody in the world, because there's hardly any in the rest of the world, it's not very much. No, but that is going to change.
Hopefully you're inspiring everyone.
It's going to change. Now we told everyone about it. That was part of the problem. A lot of people didn't even know it was here. So, okay, so let me move. My spacebar keeps not working. We've done that. Okay, so because I'm really interested in, as I said, this area of genetics, and also about how lots of people should know about the job and how it's affected. There's a picture, you can see me, that was my old front room in Manchester, leaning on my chin. And the lady next to me in the pink glasses is Mavis. And Mavis and I did a number of events where we spoke to people from different groups about different genetic conditions, so that more people would have access to what genetic counselling is, how genetic diseases affect people, and just ask the questions that they wanted to ask. So I'm going to show a little clip from a group of young people who started a charity for people with sickle cell disease. And the first question that Mavis asked them, which is the only bit I'm going to show really because it's an hour long, is just them talking about what it's like to be affected with a genetic condition, because we've spoken a little bit about that. And I kept kind of saying, we have to remember how people kind of feel during that. So I wonder if kind of listening to that a little bit might be helpful. So I'm going to skip to where this starts. I can't remember if I shared sound.
We'll give it a go and we'll see what I get to.
So we'll give it a go, but it's always something I forget to do.
A lot of time and we have a lot to cover. It's so lovely that you guys, again came to speak to us, and we had a conversation last week, and I think this is just really exciting. So one of the things that I would like to find out, could you tell us a little bit more about your charity?
Okay, cool. I'll take that question. So we are the Sound of Sickle, and we are a charitable organisation that aims to bring awareness on sickle cell, mainly around here in the UK and Ireland. And I think obviously we are all suffered of sickle cell, and we all have experienced it differently. So our main goal for us is to obviously continue that awareness approach, but also create like a community with other people like ourselves who have sickle cell, a space where they feel free and comfortable to discuss their condition, their illness, their care, the kind of whole shebang. But on the second hand, as well as kind of creating the community and a safe space through educating, creating awareness outside of our immediate community. We want to make sure that people are aware of blood types, the importance of blood types, and the very nature of sickle cell.
All right, so awareness is really important, and we've heard about different experiences that people might have with different conditions. So sickle cell is a chronic condition itself, and it has so many different impacts on health and different experiences. I mean, we tend to talk about sickle cell as one thing, but can you tell me what your experiences have been of the disease? Have they been the same? Have they been, what can you guys tell me about it?
Yeah, y'all gonna take that? Or?
I was like, jump right in. Alvin's gonna take that one.
So sorry. I think. Wait. So repeat the last bit again. Cause I just missed the last bit. That's
okay. So it's about the experiences that you've each had of sickle cell, because we tend to talk about sickle cell as a chronic disease. Yeah.
So I was going to say, I think even from when I met these guys and what we've discovered in the bigger TSS chat that we created is everyone's obviously sickle cell lifestyles and the way everything happens is different. For me personally, I'm someone who I kind of have learned how my body works. I understand my triggers a lot more So I tend to do things that might not, whereas someone else who can even know what their triggers are, still might not be able to help the way their body works. Sickle cell is definitely very, very, very individual. You could literally tell the same two people to drink 8 gallons of water, they'll both do that. But one of us might still have crisis on a regular basis, while the other might be very much all right. Some people are very, very good with blood transfusions, and for others it's not common for us. Some of us sadly get really tired when we take blood transfusions, so we don't want to do it often. And naturally, some of us just don't need blood transfusions as often. So I guess it always varies. And I think even in terms of the way we all deal with pain, so if we're talking on a mental basis, a lot of people sometimes might disregard it, oh, you'll be all right, or you'll be okay, or oh yeah, my friend has it and he just does this. It's never the same for everyone. And I think it's always good to kind of ask questions and find out how that person deals with it specifically, because they could be good with having a hot water bottle and a hot shower and a hot bath, whereas someone might need extra amounts of painkillers. And obviously, and even with that as well, I feel like even us as people with sickle cell, we always have different type of crises anyway. So we might have one where a hot water bottle settles it, and then we might have one on another day where we're in hospital for a week and we're genuinely in a different type of pain. So there's definitely an individuality to our own crisis, and literally I can promise you, just as naturally we're all not the same, just because we have sickle cell, we don't all deal with it and receive it the same.
Okay. So, can I move?
Alicia, do you?
Yes. Okay. So I thought that clip was quite useful, because it was some of the things that I was talking about how different people are, even when people have the same condition, and about how differently something that's quite physical might affect somebody mentally, and how impacted they can be by what you say and what you understand about what kind of help or support that they might need. So what happens in a genetics clinic then? So I might see somebody, and the first thing that happens in a genetic clinic is often that we take a family history. So people get referred for all sorts of things, and we've spoken through a number of different types of genetic conditions that people might see us for. And because genetics, as I said at the start, often in genetic counselling, we are often dealing with a family. We always do a pictorial representation of the family. So we always draw a family tree. So we ask lots of questions, and we ask questions about each family member, in particular showing how family members are related to each other, and we make sure that we keep a record of the medical conditions that they have. So we usually start off by asking a series of questions, moving from person to person in the family. And that is actually also part of our counselling process as well. Because as you can imagine, for somebody to be affected by something that's quite severe, has maybe caused death in the family, might be quite painful. It can be quite emotional to just talk about your family and what's happened in your family. And so it's really important that for people to be able to get what they need from the session, ask the questions that they need, that they do feel kind of really comfortable and feel that it's a really open space. And so often we really take our time with family history. It's an opportunity for people to tell the story about their family, not just the genetic condition, but how this genetic condition means something in my family. And that gives us clues for maybe what's important to spend a bit more time talking about for some families, whereas some families might, just want the facts and want to make very quick decisions. Other people might want to talk through things that they've not had a chance to talk through before. Genetic counselling appointments, therefore, are really long. So they are generally between 45 minutes and an hour long. And so if you think about going to see your GP, you don't get anywhere near that amount of time. So for lots of people, it's the first time that they've had a chance to sit down for that length of time to talk about their health and what that health means, and ask the questions that they might need to ask. We often don't just see people once as well in genetic counselling. So it might be that we see today, we spent so much time talking about family history and information that we haven't really got to talk about kind of how you think and feel about things. You might want to go away and read things and have appointments and come back for them as well. So I'll show you a quick picture of a family tree, and then we'll talk a little bit more. So as I said, when we take the genetic family history, it comes out and it looks like a picture. So circles generally are for women and people who identify as women, and squares are for men. We do little dots if it's a pregnancy that maybe had miscarried or terminated. We sometimes do a diamond if we don't know what the person is. The horizontal line that goes straight across relates couples for each other. So that's like a mother and father, you could see right at the top there. But if you look at the far right, I hope it's right on your screen as well, can you see there's like a double dash between the square and the circle? And that's to say that a relationship has ended. So, you know, those two people, even though they are the parents of those babies that miscarried, they're not together anymore. And that's really useful because you might then want to start a new relationship, say with that father, and then talk about that little part of the family. So you can draw a line across and add on the family that way. So when lines come down, that's offspring, and you kind of divide that as many times as you need to. If you don't know the number, sometimes we just draw a number in it. And there's just a huge amount of like information that's contained in a family tree, and it's kind of like our bread and butter. And so some of us are really obsessed with using like stencils and rulers to draw them, and some of us draw them freehand. But you know, having worked at like three different places that all do genetic counselling, everybody takes family trees pretty much the same way. We might just have different keys. So you can see that this one's shaded in, and it's shaded in for people who are affected with a condition called NF1. So that's neurofibromatosis. So that's a genetic condition where a parent has the condition, and then there's a 50-50 chance that they may pass it on to their child. Or sometimes the child may develop this condition for the first time, but then it's always 50-50 for their children. And that's a genetic condition where there are small growths on the ends of nerves, what we call neurofibromas. So it can cause these benign, but they can be quite plentiful, kind of lumps and bumps kind of all over the body. So it might be something that people maybe have seen and wondered what it was. It can sometimes cause quite big lumps as well, which can be quite painful depending where they are and might need removing. Sometimes it causes problems with kind of learning and development. So often in one area of learning, so they might struggle with reading, for instance, and they might be a little bit shorter than other people in the family. And so in this pedigree, everybody who's affected with that condition has been shaded a particular colour. And so it could be a different condition, you still might shade. You might have more than one condition, so you might do a shading this way or a half shading for something else, but you'll always draw a little key, just like you do kind of, I guess, in maths, like if you're doing a pie chart and you do a little key to say, so anybody can come to your pedigree and read it. So I can go and work anywhere in the world and I would be able to read another genetic counsellor's pedigree because it will be drawn in pretty much the same way, and they'll have a key for everything that I need to know, and I'll be able to gather all the information that I need. The statistics came in really useful eventually, like 20 years later, when I became a genetic counsellor, because sometimes there's lots of statistics that we do in genetics and we use our pedigrees for that. So there might be, you know, someone who's affected kind of down here, and then you draw the family tree and there's another condition like way over here. So we can statistically work out how likely it is that this person down here would be affected with that condition. And so there are different calculations that you can do, different ways that you can look at it based on how many healthy people are in the gap in between. So quite complicated calculations that you learn when you're training. And then when you finish training, you go and find an online tool where you just enter the numbers because you can't remember the whole formula. But you know it's a formula, and that's what's important. Okay, so I don't know if this is really out of date now and whether any of you know who all these women are. So you could just use the chat box now. There's no more polls, and you can answer or not answer. And Cindy might want to shout out the answer. So does anybody know what these women have in common?
You could probably take. I could take a guess based on a fact kind of about the top left person, but I will. Everybody knows that person. Yeah. So if anyone's got any guesses as to what these people might have in common, stick them in the chat box, and we'll see if anyone's got any guesses. Likewise, if you don't know, put that in the chat box as well.
I think besides being famous, I'm not too sure. I'm not clued up here. Ooh.
We've not got any guesses in the chat box, so yeah, it might be that these aren't particularly well-known people anymore.
Maybe not particularly well-known people.
We've got a couple of guesses actually. Someone's put same.
Let me have a look.
Someone's got same eye colour, which
someone's
they've got better vision than I do.
Yeah.
And then someone's gone for ovarian cancer.
Very close. The ovarian cancer is very close.
Is it
Part of the answer, in fact.
type of cancer then?
I think
answer that's related to that one.
Oh.
So my guess is breast cancer, because I'm pretty sure Angelina Jolie has BRCA1 or BRCA2 because she had an elective double mastectomy. That was like the big genetic news of my teenagehood.
Yeah, we've got someone's put breast cancer in caps.
Yeah.
So so absolutely. So you are spot on, Em. Angelina Jolie was found to have a genetic change in a gene called BRCA1. So what collectively we call these conditions now are breast and ovarian cancer susceptibility syndromes. So there are more than just BRCA1 and 2 now. There are a number of different genes, and so we have lots of genes, about 30,000 sometimes I think people say, but that's again another number that kind of goes up and down. And all of our genes come in pairs, and for some families, in these genes that normally protect us against breast and ovarian cancer, there is a mistake in just one copy of that gene. And the mistake in that one copy, I think if you remember, I spoke about the risk of breast cancer being about 10%. But if you have a mistake in one of these genes, the risk can be as high as 80% in your lifetime. So if you had, for the general population, 100 women, maybe about 10 of them would get breast cancer. But if you have a genetic change in one of these genes, we're saying that out of 10 women, 8 of those women would develop breast cancer at some point in their life. So all of these women, including the middle lady, who's Carol from EastEnders, and she was probably in EastEnders the last time I watched EastEnders, was probably about 15 years ago. So I'm not surprised if no one knows who she is, because she might not be in there anymore. Whereas all the other people were affected in their real life. She was a character in a show that was affected with the same condition and had a genetic test in a really random way that genetic tests don't happen. I think they just turn up in a hospital and someone just told them. And it's actually a lot, I'm hoping that you have gathered that there's a lot more conversation that goes into it, a lot more thought process. Some people choose to have a test. Some people don't want to have a test. The risks can be high, as I said. The risks tend to be in later life for lots of women. So the risk of breast cancer tends to be over the age of 30, even if you have one of these high-risk genetic changes. So if you think about yourself now and what age you are, and if this was in your family, can you think how you would feel? What kind of decisions you might make? The reason that Angelina Jolie, you mentioned, kind of came into the headlines was because she was very open about it, and also that because of that high risk, you can have risk reducing surgery. So you can have your breasts or ovaries removed before a cancer to reduce that high risk down to a risk that's even lower than the general population, and lots of women choose to do that. So you can think a bit about how that would feel and maybe pop your thoughts or feelings in a chat. If you were a man, I guess, so, we're talking about these genetic conditions, and even though we're talking about kind of breast and ovarian cancer, women have breast and ovaries and men don't, but that doesn't mean that they can't carry these genetic changes. So that chance of passing it on, so having the genetic change, there's a 50-50 if you pass it on to your child, just like when we spoke about neurofibromatosis. That doesn't, whether you pass that on to a male child or a female child, it's the same risk. And so actually, as a man, sometimes there are much smaller cancer risks associated, but also when they're older, they might have daughters and they might pass that genetic change on to their daughters. So, when I spoke about, families and how often we might see people and how many people in the family we might see, I had one family who I saw for a genetic condition that affected babies, and her baby had sadly passed away and they were trying to have another baby. And so I saw them through kind of testing in that pregnancy. And then I saw her sister, and her sister was deaf, and her sister's partner was also deaf, which was how they met, because they were part of the same deaf community. But he had a genetic reason for his deafness. So she kind of had these two genetic conditions in the family. So we kind of spoke about that and their pregnancy and the risk of this thing that affects children, but also the risk of deafness and what meant more to them. And then I, in fact, saw the mother of those daughters, because for years she said that she didn't want to know whether this was something that she had passed on to her children, but actually it had been something that had troubled her so much that she felt that not knowing would cause her the same anxiety as knowing, and there would be a chance that actually if she knew it wasn't her, that she might be at peace. And so actually I saw the grandmother as well. So I saw so many different people of the same family over, you know, that whole 10 years of working through Manchester. So so as you can probably tell from what I said, there's a lot going on to be a genetic counsellor. There is a lot of emotions for people, a lot of ups and downs, often not as fun as a roller coaster, but it has been described as a kind of roller coaster of emotions for people. It's a roller coaster of emotions for me, because I'm working with lots of different people who are experiencing emotions at lots of different times. Lots of ethical dilemmas as well are raised during genetics. So, you know, the age at which people want to test, whether people or not want to disclose or share their genetic information with other family members who might be at risk. Sometimes we've had twins, for instance, who want to know different things about their genetic information, but they have the same genetic information. So who should have the test and who shouldn't have the test? So it can be emotionally draining, but we have lots of things put in place to look after our emotions as counsellors, and we work quite closely with each other, talk through our cases and have lots of supervision about how we deal with those. And so one patient described having a genetic counsellor as the person that puts the pieces of the jigsaw together, which I really like, because, you know, there's the person in the middle, and this condition kind of has an impact on all these sorts of things. And sometimes it just helps to be in one place and being able to orientate that all. So how do you become a genetic counsellor? So my route is the one at the top. So I did 3 degrees, but you don't need to do 3 degrees. You need a bachelor's degree or a nursing science background. And then you can do a master's in genetic counselling. So that's what you do. So, you know, bachelor's to master's. And then you spend some time being a trainee genetic counsellor so that you become registered, and then you're a registered genetic counsellor, and then you practice as a genetic counsellor, and you kind of move through like a career trajectory after that. So you're like registered, and then you're like a principal genetic counsellor, and then a consultant genetic counsellor. So there's a whole kind of pathway, which is kind of what attracted me to the job, really, that I've done lots of jobs in science, but I wanted a job that had like a nice neat ladder of where I was going to go. And then in the last few years, there've also been a route into genetic counselling, which is slightly different, which is only available in England at the moment. And this is through the STP route, or the Scientist Training Programme. And so you are employed by a hospital, and through that hospital, you gain clinical skills. You travel to Manchester for the taught parts of that, and that course is 3 years compared to a 2-year master's. And during that time, you do get a master's, but also you are gaining your practical experience of genetic counselling at the same time. The difference between the two is that you pay for a master's, and for an STP in genomic counselling, you are paid at a trainee rate. So you don't get full genetic counsellor salary, but you're paid into that route. So they're obviously highly competitive. And through that STP, as I said, you still get your MSc in genetic counselling, but then you become registered for a slightly different route, which is called the HCPC. You're a clinical scientist, but at the end, you both end up with registered practitioners who work in genetics together. Like, we all work interchangeably. It's just that different people might have access to different routes of training. So what that means is that genetic counselling is a mixed bag of people who come from all sorts of different professions. So midwives, scientists, nurses, people who were already counsellors, people who've come straight through university from doing their BSc, people who've done PhD in straight genetics or other things, psychology, teaching, social work. It's just this mixture of people who have a scientific mind and are able to understand, formulate, discuss scientific principles, but also have a caring psychological mind as well to deal with how people relate to that information. So what do genetic counsellors do? Everything, because we come from all of these diverse backgrounds, and because genetic counselling is small and interacts with so many different types of health service and health professionals, we do all sorts. So we do research, we might do research informally through our patients. We might do research formally, like I've done, to come away and do a PhD. There are all sorts of different ways of doing research when you work in this country. We do teaching, we present, we offer genetic tests, so therefore we liaise with different laboratories and to find the best tests for people, deliver the results. We work with other health professionals, we work with scientists all the time, we carry out audits for better services, we help to develop better services, we work closely with support groups, sometimes we're on advisory panels and things for support groups, and we go to lots of conferences, and there's lots and lots of paperwork. So people think that because I keep talking about the patients that you see them Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, you actually don't, you see much less patients than that, like maybe 5 or 10 patients a week in designated clinics. But then that 45-minute session requires so much work to look after that patient. So there's so many letters to write and liaising with other doctors and letters to GPs and chasing up people's results, and everybody's at different stages. And you've got to remember, you know, someone's pregnant and their result is in 3 days, but someone else had a result that's ready in a month. And so it's a lot. But, you know, I always say one of the best jobs that I've ever done and will continue to do. So I'm finished. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Sasha. I learned so much. Like, I knew a little bit about genetic counselling before, but I learned so much. And that idea of like twins wanting to know different things about them, but sharing a genome, that has like blown my mind, because we talk about this quite a lot in terms of like, you know, if like I wanted to find out something and that impacted my brother or my parents, that's one thing, but like if you're a twin and
you have the exact same genetic information, so I'm literally giving you your answer. And it happens with parents as well. So, you know, I said that there are those conditions where it's 50-50. So if your parent has it, it's a 50-50 whether you've got it. So if you come for a test before your parent does, if you don't have it, then I can never say that you didn't inherit it or you did inherit it, because it was always 50-50. But if you have it, then I know you got it from your parent, because it's the only way that you could have it. So again, in that very similar way is that I'm testing one person and I will have the genetic result for somebody else. And maybe it's a result that for very good reason, they don't want to know. So how do you negotiate that? And that is not an uncommon situation for a genetic counsellor. That happens all the time. Yeah.
Amazing. Someone's asked, and this sort of links to what we've just been talking about, are there any ethical challenges to your work sort of around personal data? So I guess there's probably like things in place I guess there's things in place to stop it being that you can easily just, you know, give out results, but what does that sort of look like as a
so in terms of that, I guess for patients, because we take so much information in a pedigree, for instance, so we don't necessarily show the actual pedigree, because there's lots of information about lots of different people in the family. And what will happen is somebody else will come who's related to that family, but they might not know that bit of the family. But I need to keep in mind that they're all related. So they're all on the same pedigree. So you do have to be quite careful. And for some, I've worked in, so in guys, we do it on a computer, which is fine because they can't see your computer screen because it's kind of at you. And in Manchester, I used to do them by hand. So you kind of like sat away from them. And if it's just their appointment, that's fine. But sometimes, you know, I've had pedigrees are like 3 pages long. So when it's got that many people on it, you might actually just take a separate family tree and then go and add it later. So we do take the confidentiality of everyone very seriously, even though we know we're working with a family. Sometimes that means that we might be privy to genetic information that they're not, and that we haven't been given the express consent to share. So when we take consent for genetic tests, we do ask if we find something, who are you happy to share it with? Can we share it with? And we usually record that. So we either record it in words in the notes, or we record it in a consent form that we file in the notes. And if people do not want to share and have an issue, then we make sure that that's flagged up on the notes as well, so that as soon as you get a file or as soon as something comes up, there's an alert on it that tells you things should or should not be shared. That's really important for looked after children, for instance. So like in kind of adoption and looked after children, again, those are files that standardly have alerts on, and we have to think very carefully about kind of who gets results and who doesn't. The other thing that's really important, I guess, in terms of ethics and personal data is who has access to it. So if we need to share, for instance, your genetic result with your cousin who's in Australia, there are ways of doing that anonymously. or we might ask you to sign a consent form, or if it's the other way around, ask them to sign a consent form so that we can have access to it so people kind of know. Your DNA itself, even though we take a tiny amount, it's a masses of DNA. And so we don't just throw it away because it's quite precious stuff. So that continues to be stored in the NHS with your permission. So if you ask for it to be destroyed, it will do. If you don't, it remains in the NHS. It remains there in case you ever need another genetic test. So you don't ever need a blood test again because your DNA is there. Or if you maybe aren't around anymore, maybe you've passed away and other relatives need access to that DNA in order for them to do a test. If we've got you to sign kind of accept consent and express your wishes that you would be happy to do that, it opens up the possibility for families to be able to have tests that they might not have been able to do before. There are so many ethical dilemmas, Hatem. So
I
tried to sum them up, but it is a job that requires ethical discussion all the time.
No, and it must be interesting, sort of like you personally, as the person almost in the middle, like knowing that bits about this family that I don't know, must be like a weird. I guess you put your professional like hat on, right? But like personally, that must be kind of weird knowing that you know a thing about this person's aunt that they can't know. Like that must feel odd.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the impact on yourself of dealing with all of those things, is real, and it's not always that easy to put a professional hat on, particularly when risks are very high, or that sharing this information, if somebody, we spoke about breast cancer, for instance, and the risk is from the age of 30, and you've got someone in front of you who's 29 years old, the risk is suddenly really ramping up, and that there is this test that you wish you could offer them, but you can't because either consent hasn't been given, or so those, sometimes it takes a long time to be able to figure that out. We have lots of meetings as teams where we try to come up with a consensus for the best interest and whose best interest it is, and we have to document that. There are other mechanisms often within hospitals where you get external people to come in and help you make those decisions. So it can be quite tricky, and sometimes people have different feelings about what should or should not be tested for. So I've had families where there's a risk of what I would consider not necessarily a serious condition in a pregnancy, but that family is experiencing it as something quite serious that they would end a pregnancy based on, and that can feel quite difficult as well. But we have this phrase that we or I guess a theory or a way of working that we always have, which is called holding unconditional positive regard. And so it's this ability to always just hold your patient in this unconditional positive regard, that the decision they make is the right decision for them. So I think that goes a bit further than just putting your professional hat on. It's more of an empathic way of being okay with the fact that your decision might be very different from a decision that somebody else might make.
And I guess it's also sort of, it must at an emotional level help you place that control and power back at the patient, that you might be tempted to think that X, Y, and Z, but actually at the end of the day it's their life, and so the control has to be back in their hands at some point. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. I think given the time, we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. No problem. I have learned absolutely tons. And if people have further questions, I'm going to put our email address back up on the screen. Okay. In fact, I will do that just now. And I had 2 links. I don't know if you send the students something else. Yes, I can put the links on. Put the links online. So our email address is on the screen. So people have further questions, pop those to that email address and we can pass them on to Sasha. If you're looking to catch up with any of the previous sessions, we had one almost a month ago, and that'll be on our mystemfuture.org website. You can follow us on social media. And if you're part of our MySTEM Futures student cohort, you can also write blogs for this website as well, as part of your Engaging the Public hours. But Sasha, thank you so much for joining us. No problem. And thank you everyone else for tuning in. And we've got another session in about a month that we'll put more information up in a couple of probably next week. So hope to see some of you for that too. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.